Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I would like to start by first thanking the facilitators of the working group and the WTO for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning, though virtually. As said, my name is Hala Razyan. I'm with the Secretariat of the International Resources Panel. And indeed, we can go to the next slide, please. So before I start, maybe just a quick introduction of who the IRP or the International Resource Panel is. We are a United Nations Environment Program initiated science policy body. Our main focus is to study resources, and we provide science-based and policy-relevant information to members. You are probably familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The International Resource Panel provides a very similar function, that we do not feed directly into any convention, and therefore our work cuts across all of them. On the next slide, I also want to take a little moment to make sure we're all starting on the same page by really understanding what do we mean when we say resources. Well, at least for the International Resource Panel, we have two categories. One is what we call material resources. This is biomass, like crops for food or energy or wood, even for industrial applications. Fossil fuels, metals, iron, aluminum, copper, and other similar products, and non-metallic minerals, which is more sand, gravel, mainly things used for industrial applications and construction. Now, those four materials are what we call material resources. And when we add land and water on top of that, we have the broader category of natural resources. And my presentation today will largely focus on the first four of these, the material resource category. So on the next slide, please. Why do resources matter, actually, and why is it important to talk about them? On the next slide, well, resources are essentially the foundation of our socioeconomic system. When standards of living have increased over time, it has largely depended on also our increasing use of these resources. You see in this graph that our use of resources has more than tripled since 1970, where we started at around 30 billion tons, and now we are at around 106.6 billion tons. Now, over the last few years, we saw some dips in that resource use, attributed, for example, to the COVID-19 pandemic, and recent global inflation. And those same processes have demonstrated to us really the fragility and vulnerability of our global supply chains. Now, material resource we expect to continue to grow, and especially to lift up people and countries that have not yet attained dignified standards of living, and to continue to industrialize and urbanize. As we know, these processes are happening. But also importantly, we need these resources to facilitate some transitions, like the renewable energy transition, that's expected to require a huge amount of especially metallic minerals to fuel that process. So if we continue moving things along the way we are, we can expect that our resources will grow by 60% by 2060. And that's a huge increase. So the reason we feel that resources are an important agenda to discuss is that we're not only talking about, the physical materials, we're really talking about the long-term capacity of our natural systems to deliver our human well-being and security for all through our socioeconomic systems. If we go to the next slide, please, you'll see this loopy spaghetti diagram. And in the blue is essentially the flow of our resources through those economic systems. So starting from the extraction through to the consumption and eventually our waste and disposal of those materials. And the very thin line that you see looping around the bottom, that is essentially the percentage of secondary materials that are used in manufacturing and construction activities as of 2019. And that's what we could say is where we stand at the moment in terms of a circular economy with these resources. But what we have also found in our studies is that even if we leveraged all of the tools available to our disposal now to deliver a circular economy, the way our socioeconomic systems are structured means that we could only ever achieve a 40% rate of circularity in our systems. So what we really need to do if we're serious about pushing things forward to a circular economy is change the way those socioeconomic systems are operating. And that, of course, deals with trade as well. On the next slide, just one final point about why resources are important is that the way they are extracted and processed, that's what we've measured. We haven't looked at the impacts of their consumption, but just from the extraction and processing, the upstream side, we see that the way we use these 4 resources contributes to 90% of land-related biodiversity loss. If land use change is taken into account, we reach 60% of global GHG emissions, which are linked to these processes. And just from the upstream part, not even looking at consumption and disposal, we're releasing 40% of PM2.5 particulate matter into the air, which we know is extremely detrimental to human health. So the way we are extracting and processing these 4 resources is a main driver of what UNEP is calling the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity loss, and waste and pollution. The next slide looks at 2 important conventions, the Climate Convention and on the left, and the Biodiversity Convention on the right. And we've posited, you see the thin dotted black line, global targets based on those conventions. And you see the CO2 line slopes downwards, indicating decreasing GHG emissions, while the flat line of biodiversity is no net loss, is a no net loss target. And all of those colored lines in the background, those are the actual impacts from our current use of resources as we stand. So you see we are far beyond reaching any of those goals. And in fact, the way we use our resources greatly impacts our ability to meet those global commitments. Next slide, please. And the next slide as well. So coming to trade, a few things that we've noted about trade and these resources is that direct trade of these materials has grown about 6 times since 1970. And you can see that the lion's share of that trade is in the dark gray lines here, and that's fossil fuels. And the second largest material represented here is metal ores, which is about 1/4 of the total. So fossil fuels represent about half, and metal ores represent about a 1/4 of the total of global trade materials. On the next slide, we have a representation of the physical trade balance. Now, this is an indicator of whether a country or region is a net importer or a net exporter of primary materials, and it helps to determine a country's position along global supply chains. So it's essentially direct physical imports minus direct physical exports, what comes in and out of your territory. So when we categorize this into wealth bands, as we've done here, from low income to high income, we see that there has been a consistent transfer of material resources from the low and the lower middle income groups to the higher income groups. And what we also notice that's interesting is that as of 2014, the upper middle income group, which had previously been firmly in the exporting category, shifted to become more of an importing category. And the same change occurred with the high income group. So the upper middle income group is that kind of light purple line that goes from the bottom to the top. And the upper middle income group is the purple lines. And you see that they shift to become net exporters and providers of materials. So this has been a really interesting change that we've seen in the dynamics. However, consistently, the low income and the lower middle income groups have supplied materials to the higher income groups over time. And on the next slide, you see that there's another dynamic at play in that the high-income groups actually have consistently exported the environmental impacts to the low and lower income groups, to all other groups, actually. So you see the high-income groups on the left here, and that's the displaced environmental impacts, whereas the lines above the black horizontal line reflect environmental impacts occurring within those regions. Now, this is also interesting because, for example, in 2022, more than half of global land-related biodiversity loss occurred in Africa and Latin America, but less than 10% of global value added was remained in that region. Conversely, almost half of global value added was generated in Europe and North America, but less than 10% of water stress and biodiversity impacts occurred there. So when we look from this resource perspective, we not only see that resource use is driving environmental impacts, but that there are huge inequalities in the way these resources, their benefits and their use are being shared across the world. So for the next slide, and I think we'll go immediately to the next one as well in the interest of time, just to think about, with this big picture about the way resources are used, what's the role of trade then in supporting these transitions to a circular economy? On the next slide, this is the IRP mantra, you can say, which is decoupling. And we believe that if we can reduce the overall number of resources that flow in and out of our global economy, this will reduce the environmental impacts. But at the same time, you can continue to grow your economy and you can continue to grow your well-being in important ways. And when we talk about reducing resource use, we're really talking about making the space for resource use to grow where it's most needed. So in countries that are already consuming very high levels, this needs to go down. And that will enable countries who still need to grow their resource use, for example, to develop infrastructure or deliver basic and even more human needs, to have the space to use the resources that they need, but keep us within the capacity of our planet. And for this, on the next slide, we need a process of transition and transformation. And that's for us is phasing up and ramping up all of the good practices that we have learned about in the past, and importantly, phasing out those practices that are harmful. And on the next slide, very quickly, and apologies because of the time, I'm running through this rather quickly, but happy to provide more information as you might need it. But on this side, you see the outcome of the IRP modeling exercise in our recent Global Resources Outlook. Left-hand side is if we just keep going the way we're going, and you see consistently impacts, pressures rising. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we can still grow our GDP, that dotted line. We can increase our well-being, but the impacts in our resource use moderate and eventually decline. And that sharp red line on the bottom that goes down, that's actually the GHG emissions, which we can see decreasing with potentially up to 80% by 2060. So the way we have modeled shifts to the economy, we have found that this can work and we can do this. But what's needed for that to happen, on the next slide, please, is, as we said, bold policy action that changes the way our socioeconomic systems are fundamentally operating. And this includes governance, finance, trade, the way end consumers finally consume demand, and of course, enabling transitions to a circular economy. Before I dive into the trade aspect, and on the next slide, please, apologies, I just wanted to set out a core principle that we work with when we think about trade. For us, trade needs to strike a balance, of course, between enabling countries to adopt more stringent environmental protection and circular economy measures, but also abide by the basic principles of the WTO for non-discrimination in trade. So this is just a baseline in whatever we recommend. We have this framework in mind that when we apply these recommendations, this thinking needs to be central to the way we look at things. And on the next slide, while we definitely need to reduce resource demand through decoupling and circular economy strategies, and that's desirable from an environmental standpoint, it's nonetheless important to consider the implications, especially in terms of lost export earnings for low-income, resource-dependent countries, right? Trade agreements need to be leveraged in a way that help these countries reduce their environmental impacts and mitigate any negative spillover effects of those new policies that come into play. So this is where the key role of governance strategies comes into play, especially helping countries to diversify their economies and move into important sectors like recycling and renewables, and targeted capacity building and development assistance to give these countries the widest space possible to facilitate this transition. And I note in the table 5 of your MC13 outcome document, these two areas are highlighted as potential action areas moving forward. And we deem these two areas as quite critical to bring everyone along into this transition. So on the next slide, please, a couple of recommendations, just checking the time, to go through. The first one, redirecting, repurposing, reforming public subsidies for sustainable resource use. This is not new. This is something that the WTO already considers. It's extremely important. And I think our main message coming out of our report is that there has been talk about subsidies for decades, and now it's the time to actually shift them and do it quite quickly so that we can get the positive benefits from this change that we have been looking for. The second point is on trade governance innovations. So number one is recognizing and reflecting the actual costs and impacts of resources. And again, this is something that you have highlighted in your work program. I read under transparency, standards and regulations. If we go to the next slide, there's a couple of indicators I wanted to talk you through that can help with this process that the IRP measures already. We have a global database that's publicly available online for everyone. And actually, these two measures are already used to report on the SDGs. So countries are already using these indicators. The first one is domestic material consumption. And this is a direct measure of materials managed in an economy. It's what is domestically extracted plus your trade balance. So basically, it's everything that comes in and out of your physical territory. Now, ultimately, everything that comes in and in will need to be disposed of. So that's why domestic material consumption can be thought of as an indicator for sustainable materials waste management and as an indicator for the long-term waste potential of your national economy. And that's why it's an important indicator for the circular economy. So as an example, under domestic material consumption, my phone would be about, a couple of 100 grams maximum. It's the actual physical foam that I hold in my hand, which I would hold to show you right now, but I'm using it to look into your room. The other measure is the material footprint. Now, this accounts for the consumption perspective. So the material footprint basically attributes all of the materials mobilized globally to an end consumer and product. So under this perspective, that same mobile phone would weigh about 70 kilograms. So when I think about the domestic material consumption perspective, it was a couple of 100 grams. But when I think about my material footprint, so everything all over the world that was needed in the production and processing from extraction onwards of this phone, it gets to something like 70 kilograms. So this is important because it means that the production of my phone caused environmental impacts elsewhere, that are often not accounted for when we think about that phone. And that's why the material footprint is sometimes called a just indicator. And it helps us to really understand these inequalities and these differences, especially related to our products. So these are a couple of indicators I wanted to highlight for you as you thought about, your transparency and your standards and regulation measures. They're already available, they're already used by countries. And actually, the International Resource Panel at the moment is undertaking some work to add even more indicators to help us track and monitor a circular economy to these data sets. If we go back one slide, back to those policy recommendations, thank you. We have a couple of others listed here, like provisions of sustainable resource use and trade agreements, which is already happening as well, where countries are referring to, for example, climate commitments in their trade agreements. But we need to see much more of this. Strengthened mandatory due diligence to set sustainable resource management standards and enabling local resource value retention. And as I said in the beginning, whenever we think about these different due diligence or enabling local resource value retention, we have to bear in mind the potential negative effects of any of those measures that may come about and try to implement measures that mitigate those negative outcomes and support as much as possible the main positive outcomes that we look for. So if we skip forward, there's a couple of policy implications here. So essentially, in a nutshell, the policies that the WTO puts forward could enable a balance between helping countries adopt environmental protection and circular economy measures while abiding by the principle of non-discrimination in trade. And environmental considerations, including those related to resource extraction, should be prioritized. And primary barriers for a circular economy need to be looked into more deeply. So, for example, one barrier that we have noted is a lack of conceptual definitions that are shared. And this hinders project when you're making regulations. So, thinking about the different definitions that are used and trying to come up with standards that apply. There are other rules also for regional trade agreements. And at a minimum, I think they need to ensure that we don't undermine commitments related to waste and hazardous materials. And they can play a key role, for example, by discouraging or prohibiting harmful subsidies and liberalizing trade in renewables or positive areas, for example. So these are just some policy implications that can be thought of, and again, within the framework of non-discrimination in trade. On the next slide, please. Just some reflections on your work program after having read it with much interest. So I have already reflected on table 5 in terms of the importance of capacity building, technology transfer, transparency, standards, and regulation. But I also wanted to reflect on figure 2, where you have tracked the different types of instruments that are available. And what struck me is that most of them seem to happen at the end side, which is the recycling side and the waste disposal side. And what I've been talking about today and what we feel is really critical is on the other side there, where you have the raw material extraction, the production side, where there are actually very few measures currently in place. But however, that kind of earlier side of the process of the supply chains are critical when we think about a circular economy, because that's kind of the reduced by design part. It's the part that lays the foundation for the circular economy. We don't just want to keep doing the same thing and repeat the cycle and have rebounds and, just deal with wastes and emissions that are growing. This is an opportunity to really think about changing fundamentally the way we deliver human needs and how we meet human needs for people around the planet. And that starts at the very beginning, from how we pull out resources from the earth and how we use them. So thank you very much for your time. The next slide shows the references of where you can find some of the more information about the materials that I've shared today. And just to highlight that the International Resource Panel is also at the moment undertaking 2 new scientific assessments that might be of interest to your group. One is about advancing the circular economy in consumer electronic markets with case studies in the USA and Ghana. And the other is about global resource trade for a circular economy with climate and just resource use goals. So we'd be very happy once those studies are ready to once again share the findings with you. And the next slide shows how you can get in touch with us at the Secretariat. We're always happy to provide additional information and support as needed.